Today's episode is sponsored by Republic Boot Company in Houston, Texas. One of the owners and craftsmen at Republic Boot Company is a songwriter named Brad Boyer. I first heard of Brad and Republic Boots last summer when my friend Tom Russell emailed me a picture of his new boots. He said he'd played a show in Houston the year before, and this young songwriter came up to him after the show and said he wanted to measure his feet and build him a pair of boots. They had settled on a Casey Tibbs theme, and he made Tom a beautiful pair of black boots with a white inlay of a cowboy on a bucking horse on the tops of the boots. Fast forward a few months, and I get a message from Brad Boyer saying he's a big fan of the podcast and that he'd like to get involved with supporting Cowboy Crossroads. Well, I could not be more pleased to partner with Brad, and I look forward to telling you more about Brad and his boots on future episodes. You can find out more info and order your own boots at republicbootcompany.com. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different because I'm featuring two guests remembering the wonderful poet S. Omar Barker. S. Omar Barker was born in Beulah, New Mexico in 1894 and died in 1985 in Las Vegas, New Mexico. According to a family biography, Barker's parents set out from Texas for New Mexico in 1889 with 56 head of cattle, 12 head of mares and colts, a yoke of oxen, 2 teams of horses, and 3 covered wagons loaded to the top of the sideboards. Omar Barker spent his life in the Las Vegas, New Mexico area, and he worked at a number of jobs, including teaching school, serving in the state legislature, serving in France during World War I, and playing trombone in Doc Patterson's cowboy band. But he was first and foremost a writer. He is said to have written as many as 1,500 short stories, 1,200 articles, and 2,000 poems. He was married to Elsa Barker, a fine writer in her own right, and both Omar and Elsa were presidents of the Western Writers of America. Barker was known for his keen sense of humor. His full name was Squire Omar Barker, which made his initials S.O.B. Barker had the idea to use his initials for his brand and to turn the S on its side, making his brand the Lazy S.O.B. But according to Barker, when he went to register the brand with the state of New Mexico, some other lazy SOB had beat him to it. His poetry is cherished by ranching families and working cowboys, and he's become one of the most recited of all the classic cowboy poets. In talking about Barker's poetry, Fred Gibson once stated, "It's as western as sagebrush, authentic as a brush-scuffed old boot, and full of the warm-hearted humor that seems to always be a part of the men who ride where the range is wide." I'd like to start today's show with a poem from Barker's 1954 book, Songs of the Saddlemen, entitled Pert Near. They called him Pert Near Perkins, for unless the booger lied, he'd pert near done most everything that he had ever tried. He'd pert near been a preacher, and he'd pert near roped a bear. He met up with Comanches once, and pert near lost his hair. He'd pert near wed an heiress who had money by the keg, and he pert near had the measles. And he'd pert near broke his leg. He'd pert near been a trail boss, and according to his claim, he'd pert near shot Bill Hickok, which had pert near won him fame. He'd pert near rode some broncs upon which no one else had stuck, and in fact, he was the feller who had pert near drowned the duck. Now mostly all the cowboys on the lazy SB spread, they took his talking with a grin and let him fight his head. But one named Tom McGinnis sorta told it to him rough. He said, "You're riding with an outfit now where pert near ain't enough. We tie our lash ropes to the horn, and what we catch we hold, and pert near is one alibi we never do unfold. In fact, right now I'll tell you that no word I ever hear sounds quite so plain damn useless as that little pair pert near." Well, that's how old Tom McGinnis laid it out upon the line, and like a heap of preachin' talk, it sounded mighty fine, but one day Tom McGinnis, while riding off alone, he lamed his horse and had to catch some neighbor Nestor's roan to ride back to the ranch on. But somewhere along the way, a bunch of Nestors held him up, and there was hell to pay. Tom claimed he hadn't stole the horse, just borrowed it to ride, but them Nestors hated cowboys, and they told him that he lied. They cussed him for a horse thief, and they'd caught him with the goods, and they set right out to hang him in a nearby patch of woods. They had poor Tom surrounded with their guns all fixed to shoot, and it looked like this poor cowboy sure had heard his last owl hoot. They tied a rope around his neck and throwed it o'er a limb, and Tom McGinnis pert near knowed this was the last of him. Then suddenly a shot rang out from somewhere up the hill, and them Nestors dropped the rope and ran like Nestors sometimes will when bullets start to whizzin'. Tom's heart leapt up with hope to see old pert near Perkins riding towards him at a lope. "Looks like I pert near got here just in time," old Perkins said, "to see them Nestors hang you." Tom's face got kinda red. "You pert near did." He pert near grinned. "They pert near had me strung. You're looking at a cowboy that has pert near just been hung. And also one that's changed his mind, for no words ever said can sound as sweet as pert near when a man's been pert near dead." Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy West and beyond. Today I have two guests sharing their memories of S. Omar Barker. Our first guest is Georgia Snead. Georgia Snead was the grandniece of S. Omar Barker, and I'm very sorry to say that Georgia passed away last year, about 6 months after this interview was recorded. I'll always treasure getting to know Georgia and spending a little bit of time with her at the original Barker homestead outside of Las Vegas, New Mexico, where we discussed Barker's life and poetry. She showed me Barker's barn and let me look through Barker's personal scrapbook of poetry, photos, and newspaper clippings. She was a lovely lady. Here's Georgia Snead.
My name is Georgia Phillips. My maiden name, Snead, is my married name. I was born and grew up in Las Vegas, New Mexico. And my grandmother was Omar Barker's big sister. She was born in 1884, and he was born in 1895. So there was about 11 years difference. But it was a big family. There were originally 11 children. But he was the youngest, and he was born here in the Sapio Canyon, and also his brother Marion. So he was a native New Mexican. He spoke Spanish well. He did a little bit of everything. After he got his college degree, he taught. He was a school principal. He was a forest ranger. He served in the state legislature and did a lot of writing until he found his true profession, his true calling. But he'd been doing that from the time he learned how to write. He won an early essay contest when he was, I think, still in grade school, and the prize was 100 2-cent stamps, which I guess was a pretty good prize. And his parents were postmasters on this route in the Sapio Canyon, which was called Beulah Route. And then when he was a little bit older, he won a newspaper contest that he actually got a silver loving cup for. He was about 15 at that time. So he was writing, and there are evidences in the New Mexico Normal University of plays he wrote and poems, different things in the yearbook. He was editor of a yearbook one year, so he's all the time writing. But that family came to the Sapio Canyon in northern New Mexico near Las Vegas in 1889. They came in covered wagons, originally from the hill country in Virginia, but they ended up in Texas, in Moran, and I forget where else, for several years, and then came to the high country of New Mexico because my great-grandmother, Priscilla Jane Barker, suffered from asthma very badly, and her husband, Squire Leander Barker, had found that a high dry climate might be good for her, and indeed it was. When they came here, she pretty well got rid of the asthma. So here they were in this little isolated mountain valley and way out in the middle of nowhere, and that's where they made their lives. And that's where Omar and Elsa lived until the mid-1950s, when his health became a bit of a problem and they felt they needed to move to town, Las Vegas.
Can you describe where we're sitting right now?
Okay. We're sitting in a cabin that was built for my grandmother by her sons, her adult sons, in 1933, after the house she lived in that had been built by her father, Squire Leander Barker. That house burned with all her possessions, and she was essentially left homeless. And so they built this little adobe cabin for her to live in, which she did for several years before she remarried. She married an old childhood friend and moved to Colorado. So, and since then, it's belonged in our family. It's part of the original homestead, and it's only a few acres that are part of that original Barker homestead. The section that Omar and Elsa lived in, they bought from his father, and they named it Rincon Montoso, which means wooded cove. And it was they built it up in a little side canyon where it was pretty isolated, because as writers, they needed to be isolated where they could write without being disturbed. And because people loved them, they had to guide their privacy, guard it, I should say. And they did. And we respected that as a family.
I've noticed in the cowboy poetry community, everyone pronounces his name Omar, but I've noticed the family and the locals around here pronounce it Omer. I'm assuming that was the. It's funny.
I've never noticed the difference, but it was probably I think we call him Omar.
Yeah, so that seems to be.
But the first name Squire, he was actually named after his father, and of course that wasn't a title. His father was the last of 13 kids, and he always said they ran out of names. Named him Squire Leander, and but Uncle Omar never went by Squire.
We talked a little bit earlier about the different pseudonyms that he wrote under. Could you just mention those that you recall?
Yes, he wrote like maybe a half dozen novels for kind of the Hardy Boy type recipients, young men, and they were Dan Scott Westerns. And so that was one pseudonym. And then he wrote a lot of short verses and sort of little and limericks and little quips, and he used pen names there. Limerick Luke was one he wrote limericks under, and Rattlesnake Robert was another one. There was Sapio somebody. He uses another pen name. Yeah. But sometimes you would see a publication that would have something by Omar Barker and something by Limerick Luke, and magazine publishers don't want to publish more than one item by one author, so that's why he would use different names. Well, the things I remember about Uncle Omer was how much fun he was. He liked to be around kids. They didn't have any of their own, but they loved young people, and my brother and I were fortunate enough to be the beneficiaries of that love. And he had a wonderful sense of humor, which we appreciated, and he and my dad had the same quick wit, and the repartee between them was always right on target. He liked to show us how to fish, which we did in his pond, and he and Elsa had a cow, and it produced more milk than they could drink, so he used to make, I thought it was cottage cheese, but my brother informs me last night that it was clabber. He says cottage cheese has to be made with pasteurized milk, and of course they didn't have pasteurized. Anyhow, it was white, and they fed the fish in the pond with the leftover clabber. So he would take us fishing down by the pond and give us our poles, and then tie a little white rag on the hook, and boy, did we get good fish that way. And it pleased him to see the excitement of kids learning to fish and catching fish. And I also remember, and I'm not sure my brother Robert, I didn't ask him about this, if there was a calf of suitable size, he was often given the adventure of trying to ride the calf, which was great fun for everybody. I'm not sure about how he felt about it, but we played in the hay and in the barn and had a good time. We loved to watch him milk cows, the cow, and there were barn cats who would come at milking time, and he was quite proficient at squirting streams of milk into their waiting mouths.
Barker's 1954 book, Sunlight Through the Trees, included the following dedication to his wife, Elsa. To Elsa, who always listens with her heart.
Their home was charming. Elsa was a wonderful decorator, a cook, and could do just about anything. And she was an accomplished horsewoman. One time my folks saw her some event, and she had a scratch on her nose, and they said, well, what happened to you? And she said, oh, not much. My horse rolled on me, but I'm okay. But the thing that impressed me the most was that she went outside her back door one day, and there was a mountain lion, and she went inside and got a rifle and shot and killed it, which showed rather remarkable aplomb. But she never wanted to kill deer. They were somehow in a different category. But she killed turkeys. I remember they killed quite a few turkeys. But she was a remarkable woman. I don't think she took up writing until maybe the 40s, somewhere along in there. And she developed quite a craft in writing Western novels and short stories, many of which were printed in Ranch Romances and other pulp magazines. She had an agent, which he never had, but the agent, I think, was British, and so some of her things were printed in England, and some were translated into French and Dutch. But she developed her craft quite well. One of the favorite stories I told last night demonstrated how Omar and his brother Elliot, who was head of the State Game and Fish Department and was well-known conservationist nationwide and had quite a reputation, they knew this wilderness area, which of course in the early days was not a designated wilderness area. That came later, the Pecos Wilderness Area. It was like the back of their hand. They had run cattle up there when their father had when they were young men, boys and young men, and became very familiar with that whole area. And Elliot has written about it in a book called Beatty's Cabin. But they used to tell hunting stories, and they'd say, "Oh, do you remember when we were lion hunting and there was a certain area and there was a sandstone cliffs and stuff?" And the other one would nod, "Oh yes, I know that area well." Or, "Do you remember that tree with a snag on such and such?" This huge wilderness area. They knew practically every tree and rock. Well, years later, around 1950, my parents had bought a Chevrolet Suburban Carryall, which is similar to the SUVs that we have now, in preparation for a special trip they were taking, and they wanted to test to see how well it performed. So there was a very bad, very poor road to the top of Elk Mountain, which is over 11,000 feet high and one of the highest mountains in this part of the state. And the road had been built to access a mica mine, and mica was used for gun sites or something during the war. And my father discovered that if you could find somebody to take you to the top of Elk Mountain on that road, you could hike over the wilderness area to the Sapio Canyon. It's only about 10 miles. And so we have taken that hike a number of times. Well, that day we weren't interested in hiking. We were interested in testing the vehicle. And it performed well, and we came back down this steep road, and were just ready to enter the Pecos Canyon. And there was a little bridge over Willow Creek, and there was a piece of paper stuck in some part of the bridge, and Omar asked Dad to stop. And Dad did, and Omar got out and went over and took the piece of paper and opened it and read it. Well, astoundingly, it was a note from his brother Elliot. Here out in the wild country, a note from his brother Elliot, a recent note saying, when you read this, why don't you come over to Santa Fe for supper? And we were just speechless. How on earth did he know there would be a message for him? And it turned out that there was an answer. My brother had been home, and Elliot had called that and found out where we were. But they knew the country well and loved it dearly. And he wrote about it beautifully. Another thing I mentioned last night was the fact that his father, who was quite an amazing man, a pioneer, rancher, farmer, builder, whatever was required in those days, was a little dubious when Omar announced his desire to be a professional writer, make his living that way. And when his first book was published, Viento de los Sierras, I think it's called, he gave the very first copy of that very first edition to his father and inscribed it. And after that, his father acknowledged that, yes, indeed, he could make his living being a writer, which was a major step. And he worked hard at it. He was at his desk hours every day, cranking out stories and poems and articles and sending them off, and had a huge correspondence going. So it was hard work being a writer, but very successful. couple things I remember. He always smoked Roytan cigars. He often had a cigar in his mouth. And we, of course, were kind of intrigued by that because nobody in our family smoked. And so he would take a leaf of lettuce from his wonderful garden and sprinkle sugar on it and roll it up. And we'd put it in our mouths as pretend cigars and then eat it, which was quite good. Also, I have a photograph of him teaching us a spider walk, which means you had to get down on the ground on your back and get your arms and legs to act like spiders. And he's doing it with us. He's having the best time. So he loved that. He loved having fun with children.
As I talked about last night, his poetry is just so well loved by the ranching community and by working cowboys, and he captured that lingo so perfectly. Do you have any insight into how he was able to do that?
Well, he just had that knack, and he had a wonderful command of the English language, but he had that ear for hearing the lingo of the cowboy talk and was able to write it, which was a real gift.
How do you think he would feel knowing how embraced he is now by the cowboy poetry community and the ranching and working cowboy world?
Well, of course he would be pleased to know that the working cowboys were honoring him with and the ones that, like you, who have fallen in love with what he's written and have been reciting it and sharing it with others. He would be pleased. But he was a very modest person. There was very little ego in his in him. He very modest. He did not seek fame. And of course, he had excellent awards, the two Spur Awards and the Levi Strauss Award and the Cowboy Hall of Fame. And is it Oklahoma City?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's one of the first, I think, the first writer to be inducted.
Might be an indictment.
Yeah, right. I don't know. So he was honored among his peers, which was important to him. And of course, Elsa, probably the first, maybe the only woman to be the president of the WWA, or Western Writers. So that was an honor.
Well, that's great. Those are great memories and remembrances. I love hearing those.
Well, both Omar and Elsa were very, very special, lovely, gentle, intelligent people, just about the best anywhere.
My second guest on today's episode is cowboy poet Waddie Mitchell. Waddie was my guest on the very first episode of Cowboy Crossroads. Waddie was also the first cowboy poet I ever heard, and he was also the first person I heard recite a poem by S. Omar Barker. I knew Waddie had called Barker on the phone, and I asked him to tell me that story. Here's Waddie Mitchell.
In Elko County, some of these rural schools didn't have the budget to have their own libraries for the kids, and so they had a bookmobile program going on, and that bookmobile would come out to your school once every 2 weeks. And the bookmobile driver was just a wonderful gal. And when I first went in there, I didn't even know what a library was, and I didn't know how to find a book. And she just said, "What do you like?" And she'd go find me a book. And then when she started understanding the kind of books I like, one time she brought out S. Omar Barker book, Rawhide Rhymes. And I started reading it, and 2 weeks went by, and I was only a quarter of the way through the book, so I rechecked it out, and then I rechecked it out again, and then I tried to recheck it out again, and I couldn't. You can only do so many in a row, but after the next 2 weeks, she'd let me check it out again. And this was just fascinating to me, finding this guy. Of course, I wasn't old enough to realize that you go find the author, you know. It's just a book I like. It's the book, not the person that wrote it. I couldn't imagine that. But there were so many little pieces of poetry in there that I could just relate to and just really liked. And I had been around cowboys, you know, out at the ranch that we didn't have power or radio, so people talked at night, and some of these cowboys could recite a piece of poetry. I didn't have Dr. Seuss, which is a proven method of making children love to hear because of the music and the language. I guess, caught up in the music of his poetry, which is just as smooth a rolling as anybody that's ever written verse. His language, he doesn't have abrupt sounds where they don't belong. Everything just rolls off the tongue. And for a kid just getting started in actually reading and relating to stories, he was the perfect guy for me. And when I was in the 8th grade, she come by and give me that book. It had come up and it was going to go on auction, that book was. She picked it up for a quarter or something and brought it out to me. So it was quite a bit later. It must have been, I was back from the service. No, it wasn't. No, I was on the 7S ranch, and I wasn't old enough to go in the bars and drink yet. And so when I got to Elko with the other cowboys, I would go to Capriola's and do the stuff that I wanted to do. And then every once in a while, when it got really dark and late, I could sneak into a bar. But other than that, I had just a lot of time. So I thought I'd just call him, because by then I was realizing that this is S. Omar Barker. This fellow is writing this stuff. And having no real understanding of how big this world is. You know, we lived pretty remote, and when we went to town, it was Elko, and there's 5,000 people, and that scared me to death. It was so big. So, but everybody knew everybody somehow or another. I thought, I want to know him. So I called the publishing company and asked for S. Omar Barker. I didn't know the difference, and that was the deal. I called that company and they said, no, but here's his home number. So I just put a big old pile of quarters in my pocket and would go to the Stockman's Hotel. Those days they had those telephone booths you'd step right in. And I'd ring him up. And it was kind of awkward the first time. I'm sure he was wondering what I was going to try to sell him or something. But I tried to explain to him that how much I liked his poetry, and I just really appreciate it. And I usually have a little question to ask him, because, you know, I wasn't from a country where everything was varied. It was the buckaroo tradition, and that's all I learned. So there was a lot of little sayings he'd used more than once. You can see it throughout his career. There were like tack and how to work cattle. He'd use different terms, and I called him up and just wanted to tell him that and ask him a few questions. And once he asked me who I was and what I was doing, I told him, well, sir, I'm 19 years old and I'm a buckaroo. And that's why I really like your books, because we're never around electricity, things like that. And I couldn't ask a question after that. That tickled him so much that a cowboy would call him. Now I'm saying all this from one end of the phone, not the other. I never got to look him in the eye and shake his hands. And when I say I used to call him, I'm not sure it was more than 3, maybe 4 times I called him. But I'd called him enough that when I'd say, Omar, it's Waddie, we'd just go on. That's another deal. Omar, and you probably got that at the family. Everybody called him Omar.
As mentioned previously, Barker was born in 1894 and died in 1985, just a short time after the very first cowboy poetry gathering in Elko, Nevada. I've always thought it was too bad that Barker did not live to see the popularity that his poetry would have in Elko and at the other cowboy poetry gatherings that sprouted up around the country.
Then we lost him right after the first gathering, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Well, it had been a while by that time, and I know darn well I just felt really bad that I never, And now I remember, as we talked about it, one of the first things I wanted to do when we were putting this gathering together is see if we can't get him to come out. And Hal Cannon was all for it, and the sumbitch died. So we didn't get to do it. There again, you got to realize I wasn't very damn worldly, and I didn't know how to put on festivals. I was the guy that put chairs up, and if they wanted to know what a cowboy would think, I wasn't the guy to organize, and so they asked me, do you want to call them and do it? And I said, okay. So I called them up, and I said, well, we're going to put on a deal out here, and wanted to know if you wanted to come. Oh, I'm a little old to just be driving to a party. And I said, well, this isn't going to just be a party. It's a bunch of guys are going to be doing poetry. Well, that sounds like a fine time, but I don't know if I'm going to, get out of this house and go that far. I didn't realize, I didn't know how old he was. So I told Hal, I said, let's write him a big letter. And I think Hal wrote him a letter to kind of explain to him what we were trying to do. And I'm not sure if I'd like to tell you there was an ending to that story, and there might have been, but I've forgotten it. And I think, to be honest with you, I heard more Robert Service, and I heard more Kiskadden, maybe than I did S. Omar Barker there at first. But once guys wanted to pick up poetry, I think the relatable, because Kiskadden, so much of his poetry, it was written in his later life, and so it comes from that perspective. A wiser, older cowboy in the process has already figured it out, outthought it, and is just kind of relaying that message. S. Omar Barker, although he wrote most his stuff as a sure enough mature man, there's still kind of a playfulness about it. He told me over the phone oftentimes, he says, Waddie, you know that I'm not a cowboy. I just get to hang around them a lot. And he said, I'm an academic. He says, I'm an academic who loves that life. My dad introduced me to that life, and I get to go play it in the weekends, but it fascinates me, the language and the work you fellas do. And that's what he wanted to talk about most of the time we were on the phone. He just wanted to ask. He was constantly asking me questions. Well, what do you guys do? And what's that word, cavy? You know. Well, you used remuda. We use cavieta or cavy. And he said, I've heard that a long time, but I never heard cavieta, I see, so it's Spanish word. So he was constantly gaining more stuff than I was getting out. He got more out of me than I got out of him. But I suppose that's the way any good academic does things. They just gather up every little bit of information they can. But I always wished I got to meet him, shake his hand. After he died, I went out there because I wanted to give my condolences to the family. And his niece, or his nephew, who everybody said looked exactly like Omar. It was a little shocking when he answered the door. It looked like Omar standing there. It really did. But they came in, they were just tickled pink. Anybody cared about it and stuff. But they wanted to give me his stuff. Can you go? Just all we care about is that his stuff gets out there, you know. And if we give you Pa's stuff, could you go, you know, maybe find somebody that'd make a book out of it and all this stuff. And that was early enough that I'm still on the ranch. I don't know about publishing. That just scared me. And I said, oh, I'm sure there's better people to find and go do that than me. And if I had the chance to do it again, it would have sure been different. But I just turned down that chance. And that's one of the things I'll always regret. But his family was really nice. And they told me, we sat and visited I was only there one evening, but I was there maybe 4 hours, and they'd tell me all kinds of little quips and stories about him that very, very much humanized him to me.
To conclude today's show, I asked Waddie to recite a Barker poem entitled Ranchman's Widow from Barker's 1968 collection, Rawhide Rhymes.
She had one son a doctor. Her daughter's teaching Latin. Her youngest, he's a lawyer, and she thinks a heap of that one, but one's a cow ranch foreman. That makes her old heart glad, 'cause the way he sets the saddle reminds her of his dad. Oh, she's proud to be the mother of a man who tends the sick, and of a brainy daughter, and a lawyer keen and quick. But when her old heart hankers for them old days once again, she packs and makes a visit to the range of riding men. And although he ain't ambitious for no big high-toned success, his cowboy son arouses just a heap more tenderness than all the other trio. Makes her heart feel young and glad. Just to watch him set the saddle like his old cowpuncher dad.
Alright folks, that's it for today's show. I'd like to dedicate today's show to the memory of S. Omar Barker and Georgia Snead. You can find out more about S. Omar Barker at cowboypoetry.com/sobarker.htm. I'd like to thank Waddie Mitchell for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Waddie at waddiemitchell.com. I'd like to thank Republic Boot Company for sponsoring today's episode. You can find out more about Republic Boot Company at republicbootcompany.com. You can find out more about me and this show at andyhedges.com. If you're enjoying this show and would like to help me keep it going, you can make a donation on my website, or you could leave a review and a 5-star rating on the iTunes store, or you could take the time to tell a friend to listen to the show. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.